David Blight. I direct the Gilder Lehrman Center for the Study of Slavery, Resistance, and Abolition. We've existed for 20 years. We do all sorts of events, panels, talks, book prizes, etc. And for years now, we've been putting the word legacies on a lot that we do. We exist, as we always say, to study, to create knowledge and disseminate that knowledge about slavery, its destruction, and its legacies across all borders and all time. This particular panel is very much about the legacies of slavery. And it particularly is inspired by and built around the recent book, came out in 2018, by Sasha Turner, called Contested Bodies, Pregnancy, Childrearing, and Slavery in Jamaica. We love to claim Sasha, even though she really works at Quinnipiac. She was a fellow at our center, I think in the fall of 2018, thereabout. We've invited her back to everything we do, and therefore it seems like Sasha's a part of the center, and should be, permanently. We don't have any money to pay you. Anyway, it's a thrill to do this session. We obviously chose to do it up here in the School of Public Health and the medical community for I hope obvious reasons. I want to thank a few people quickly who helped us conceive this and organize this. We have co-sponsors with the Program for Humanities in Medicine at the Yale School of Medicine and the Yale School of Nursing. And thank you to the School of Public Health for letting us use this room, or rent it, or however we got it. And especially to Kelly Edwards Campbell in the Dean's office. We also had help from faculty in outreach and thinking about this. Anna Reisman, Associate Professor of Medicine and the head of the Program of Humanities in Medicine. And Michelle Teller, Professor of Midwifery and Women's Health at the Yale School of Nursing. My job is very simple, and I'm going to then get out of the way. I'm going to introduce the moderator of this panel, and then Randi Epstein, the moderator, will introduce the panel and begin this conversation. Randi Epstein is a medical writer and educator. She teaches as a lecturer here in the Yale English department. Come on in, lots of seats up front. You sit up front, you can't get out. She's also an adjunct professor at Columbia University School of Journalism. She's writer-in-residence at the Yale, I don't know how you do all these things at once, the Yale School of Medicine. She's written articles in the New York Times, the Washington Post, and all kinds of other magazines and national publications. And I just complimented her, I couldn't help it, on her book titles. Here are her book titles, which she doesn't entirely claim, she tells me. Book titles are often created by publishers. But her books are, quote, the first, Get Me Out, The History of Childbirth from the Garden of Eden to the Sperm Bank. And most recently, Aroused, The History of Hormones and how they control just about everything. Randi will moderate this session, introduce our panelists, and we look forward to engaging with you in Q&A as well afterward. Thank you all for coming. And Randi, it's all yours.
Thanks. I think I'm on. I'm humbled to be sitting with these three prominent women today, and I want to introduce them, and I'll get the conversation going. And we're going to speak for about 45 minutes or so, and then I'm hoping that you'll all join the conversation too. We have two Sashas here with us tonight, which is going to complicate things, but we've separated them, so I don't tell them we did this, so I can look this way and that way. Sasha James Contarelli is a nurse midwife at the Yale School of Nursing, and in addition, she's president of the New York State Association of Licensed Midwives and is leading their new created task force on maternal mortality and disparate racial outcomes. She's a lecturer at the Yale School of Nursing. She's been a midwife for 17 years, And as she said, then she turned to advocacy and is involved in, I don't even think I have all of them down, but among the many things, she's the treasurer of the Midwives of Color Committee of the American College of Nurse Midwives, regional governor for the Fellows of the American College of Nurse Midwives, liaison to the American College of Obstetrics and Gynecology District 2, member of the expert task force for development of perinatal regionalization for the New York State, co-chair on Governor Cuomo's Maternal Mortality and Racial Disparities Task Force, member of New York State Maternal Mortality Steering Committee, and New York State Maternal Mortality Review Board. She is here with us today because she's going to be able to give us from her own experience and her own political work what this history means today, what the legacies are of this history. Sasha got her BSN at Howard and an MA and doctorate at New York University. Now I'm going to turn to Carolyn Roberts. Many of you know. Hold on. Wrong card. Must have switched up your backgrounds. You have joint appointments in the History of Science, History Medicine Department, African American Studies, and the program in the History of Medicine at Yale School of Medicine. Your research explores race and slavery, natural history, and botany, and you're currently working on a project, which we want to hear more about today, to heal and to harm medicine, knowledge, and power in the Atlantic slave trade. This is Carolyn Roberts' study. It's the first full-length study of the history of medicine in the British slave trade. And one of the things that we're going to hear more about today, the book's narrative is centered around the pharmaceutical and medical labor performed on a largely unknown group of African and British women and men, both enslaved and free. Her work illustrates how the slave trade functioned as an insidious, even ghostly knowledge project that pushed the boundaries of pharmacy, surgery, and natural history. Dr. Roberts also traces how the slave trade contributed to the development of the pharmaceutical industry and the modernization of medicine. She's an award-winning educator. I know that not just from the awards, but I know some of her students who rave about the time and effort and friendship that they have with you. Which I think is just a wonderful thing that you've accomplished in addition to everything else you've done. Dr. Roberts has her MA and PhD from Harvard, an MA also master's from Andover Theological School, and a BA from Dartmouth. And now the reason why we're here, our other Sasha Turner, who is an associate professor of history at Quinnipiac University. She's co-president of the Coordinating Council for Women in History. She's also the associate editor for the African American Intellectual History Society blog called Black Perspectives. You've had many distinguished fellowships, and I'm not going to list them all, but she's been a fellow, as we heard, right here at the Gilder Lehrman Center for the Study of Slavery, also Rutgers University Race, Ethnicity, and Gender Studies. She's currently working on a book on slavery and emotions. And we're here to discuss her award-winning book, Contested Bodies, Pregnancy, Childrearing, and Slavery in Jamaica. If you have not read it, go out and get a copy. You can click on Amazon, but not now. Wait till after the discussion. It's really riveting. It's a riveting book, even if you think you know the history, and we're going to ask you about that in a second. You take on a whole different perspective and have details that can be hard reading, but important reading that everyone should know. So given that, I do want to start the conversation with this Sasha and say that most of us, or maybe I shouldn't say most of us, but I, from my cursory history, tend to have always thought that the good guys are the abolitionists and the bad guys the slave owners. And you've taken this more nuanced book when I read Contested Bodies, and you've also been able to provide women with more agency. So I was wondering if you can explain this more nuanced view, and also what motivated you to research and why Jamaica.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, Randy, and thank you to my fellow panelists who are here. I really look forward to our conversations and everyone who's here. So the story of the book, I think I sort of start with, outlining the narrative arc of the book and sort of how it got started, and then come back to the abolitionist. And so the book sort of started very much in the archive, and it was a discovery of a letter, at least discovered for me. And in the letter was sort of written by a local agent in Jamaica. And the ways in which the plantations were managed in Jamaica in the 18th century is that there were local estate managers who resided in Jamaica, and they often corresponded with the owners who resided in England. Some resided in America as well. And so I came on this letter written by the plantation the plantation manager to the owner in England. And in this letter, he described in very vivid detail the ways in which he was reorganizing enslaved women's labor. So he sort of said, I put in the women who are with child in groups of 2 or 3. And the reason he explained that he was doing this was to allow them to rest in between work. And he wanted to ensure that they could rest in between work in order to protect their pregnancies. And I found the letter very interesting because my understanding up until that point, and I'm sort of speaking here in general terms, is that the plantation system, slavery was gender blind. That the enslavers sort of assigned enslaved people their labor roles without paying attention to gender. So whether you were male or female, you would work in the fields. You would have similar labor roles, cutting cane, carrying cane, feeding canes to the mill, etc. And here I came across a letter that suggested that, at least this manager on the property was paying very close attention to the labor of the women and ensuring that their pregnancy was protected. And so what I started to do was to, unpack the events around the letter. So this letter was written, I think, around 1804. And 1804 is significant because it's 3 years before the ending of the British transatlantic slave trade. And so just through further digging and placing that letter in the context of my historical understanding of 1804, what became clear to me was that the plantation owners and managers were changing the labor assignments and the way they placed women in work responsibilities in an attempt to save their pregnancy. So there was a real concern now in 1804 for protecting women's pregnancy and ensuring that they had successful pregnancies, that their children were brought to term. And so, what sparked this? What sparked this was the activism by abolitionists in England for the abolition of the slave trade. And by 1804, they were very much close to achieve this because it happens by 1807. And so what I started doing was, my interest was always in women. And so I got to the letter because I sort of went through the archive, and any letter, any document that vaguely referenced women, pregnancy, that sort of thing, I looked closer at it. But I veered off path somewhat, which is to look at the abolitionists and try to understand why was there such an emphasis on protecting women's pregnancy. It felt as if there was a little bit more there. And so part of what I discovered in doing the research is the kind of elaborate arguments that abolitionists were making around the need to encourage the biological reproduction of slaves in the colonies. And they advocated for this as a strategic way of ending the slave trade. And so it became this cost-benefit analysis of how do we sort of end the slave trade, but without causing economic damage to the plantation system. And so that sort of, is what you're referring to as, it's a little bit more complicated than the abolitionists simply saying, we need to end the slave trade and we need to end it now. In fact, I went back by at least 20 years that this proposal dates back to the 1770s and more so by the 1780s, wherein abolitionists are suggesting that planters be more attentive to women's work responsibility, that they allow them greater rations in terms of food, clothing, housing, in order to protect their pregnancy. And this was very, very critical as a way of, boosting the population growth as a way to then end the slave trade.
And how much, in terms of the agency that women have had, did they feel, oh, well, we're getting this special treatment? or was there some sort of tension between, wait, this is my body and this is how many pregnancies I want to have? Like, what can you explain a little bit about that tension and the agency that the women had?
Yeah, so the women were very much aware of the conversations that were going on in England. And there is one particular case that I really love to talk about. And in fact, most times that I do events like this, a lot of people ask about the Bessie Chambers case. And in this case, where an enslaved woman brings her case to the magistrates in Jamaica, complaining that the overseer forced her to work hard, and as a result of excessive labor and excessive punishment, she miscarried. And the way in which I sort of interpret that case is that Bessie here, as well as other women, understood the conversations that were going on in England. They understood the new demands that were now placed on their bodies, both in terms of their labor on the plantation and their labor as reproducers of the labor force. And so it was very clear that they understood those debates. But what was also interesting and important is, even though there was now this struggle to control women's reproduction, women until this point in the 1780s and after still maintained control over their bodies. And so the struggle, and part of the title of the book, I'll add, is to really talk about this as not simply abolitionists or enslavers, simply imposing their viewpoints and ideologies on enslaved women. It was very much a struggle. It was very much a contestation. So it's contested bodies between enslaved women and abolitionists, enslaved women and planters, and enslaved women and doctors.
Now, and Carolyn, I'd like you to chime in terms of your history delves in terms of misconceptions that people tend to have about women and slavery and their bodies. And can you chime in a little about what you've uncovered and in terms,
Yeah, so the work that I do, in some ways, it sort of is a prelude to the enslaved arriving in places like Jamaica and other parts of the Americas, because I focus on the slave trade. And so I'm looking a lot at what is happening in West Africa and in the context of West African slavery. So there are two different sort of categories of slaves, roughly, that we can think about. One category are the people that are being shipped. They're called very unelegantly shipping slaves that are going to be sent to the Americas. And then you have enslaved people who are situated at forts and settlements in West Africa. And these enslaved people are also having a very unique kind of life of enslavement. And what I find in the records is that, especially looking at the enslaved people that are going to be shipped to the Americas, the way that doctors deal with their bodies in these forced medical inspections that they have to do before they're being purchased, you get a sense of how brutal, how their bodies really are the focus, no sense of the humanity. That you're thinking about a kind of, you're not thinking about patients and practitioners, you're thinking about a commercial relationship where a doctor is hired by an employer, a slave trader, to get enslaved people, including women, from one part of Africa to the Americas, and they are looking to see black bodies as laboring specimens. And when you're seeing the laboring specimens, the reproductive labor is a really important part of that. And so in these forced medical inspections, you see that these things are happening over hours of one enslaved person is being examined for hours. For hours. They're going into women's cervix. They're examining the vagina, breasts, everything. And so, with Sasha's wonderful book, one of the things that I think about when I spent time with your work is that you write that women's reproductive health is already compromised by the time they get to places like Jamaica. But it's not only that, they're compromised in that way, but the fact that they're already having to recover from a kind of medical brutality and violence that has been wielded against them. And so when you write about enslaved women's agency in places like Jamaica, the fact that in this earlier moment before abolitionists are involved, enslaved women are having the ability to create their own healing communities with one another. And when I read that, it sort of took my breath away, because I thought to myself, if you imagine these women having gone through the kind of sort of medical horror that they've already experienced, where people are looking at them being examined and saying that they're weeping uncontrollably, and they're being pinned down by mariners to have these examinations done. And they get to places like Jamaica, and the fact that they can have a certain amount of autonomy and a certain amount of freedom to bear children in the way that they desire before the abolitionists sort of put their hands in it all,
Right.
is, it affected me in such a deep way when you think about that journey that they've been on.
Yeah. I think that comes in with where you started, Randy, in terms of seeing abolitionists as the good guy.
Yeah.
Because what happens is that before the 1780s, the rise of what I call pronatal abolitionism in the book, where abolitionists are making these elaborate plans for getting women to reproduce, the labor force. Women had some amount of autonomy. In fact, one of the ironies of the slave trade is that because planters were so invested in buying replacement slaves via the slave trade, they weren't too bothered by enslaved women's reproduction. They weren't paying close attention. So while the economic logic of slavery does in fact state that the child takes the mother's status and the child automatically belongs to the owner, the enslavers weren't too attentive. They weren't paying too much attention to reproduction. And so that moment before the rise of abolitionism is a moment of significant autonomy that these women have. And so what we actually see is that it's the rise of abolitionism that then now imposes this new control over enslaved women's reproduction. So it's actually the reverse. So the coming of abolitionism didn't bring freedom and liberation for women in terms of control over their bodies. It's actually, restriction that liberation.
I want to jump around intentionally so we can keep Sasha in the conversation. And I do want to go back and forth between now and then, just so we can see the relevance of the history. So we've been talking about the tensions between women and doctors and this historical legacy. And I'm wondering if you can speak now from your standpoint from midwifery and all this advocacy. Is there a legacy from all this, and do you see what sort of tensions and trust or distrust in terms of caregivers and care receivers, whether it's doctors, nurses, midwives, and the women?
Well, what I would say first is to just look at the statistics that are being revealed in many of your newspapers, most recently about maternal mortality and morbidity, especially the disparities, the large disparities related to Black women and women of color in general. So is there a legacy? Absolutely. This book was quite riveting for me. I started reading the book and I started discussing it with my colleagues. I am West Indian myself, and so some of what was happening, all of what was happening in Jamaica happened in my parents' homeland and where I was born in St. Croix, the Virgin Islands. My grandmother paid particular attention to tell me a lot about my history as being a person of color from the islands. But this book really opened my eyes, and in the work that I do today, it just made sense and it clicked about my history and what I see today as I care for patients, as we all care for patients in the maternal child health field. It absolutely makes sense in that the women would come together and try to preserve some of their history and some of their own birth practices and preserve their autonomy by coming together. And that's where you saw saying midwives. I see you mentioned it in the book. And physicians coming over from England and trying to abolish this camaraderie, this community that these women are building together in such horrible conditions, trying to preserve their own dignity and their autonomy and enforce the slave owners and the planters' rules on these women by building hospitals on plantations and having the midwives removed or telling them they cannot take care of the women anymore, or starting the rumors and saying they're quacks and what they're doing is actually harming the women, as a way to dismantle their own coming together and their own healing and trying to be resilient and start the process of healing from all of these horrors that they have endured on their passage to come to the colonies and America. So what I see today is not much has changed, unfortunately, in maternal child health care and how we as a medical society look at women and treat women. And we as a society look at people that have uteruses and breasts and try to impose our views on their reproductive cycle, when and where they should birth, how you should birth, and with whom you should birth. So it saddens me that I can read a book and bring it forward to 2019 and see such parallels in our healthcare. When are we going to stop this? When, and what is it going to take?
I want to go back now, it's just so you can, I want you to explain for those who don't know, and you explain it well in the book, just sort of this system of health care on the plantations. So one thing, you talk about the plantation owner, but a distant owner. So if you can explain, one, the difference between the plantation owner and the manager, and then who were the doctors, and who were, you talk about both enslaved and free, I think paid midwives. So who were all these people and how did they fit, and how did a doctor decide, okay, that's what I want my job to be, is to be the healer?
Right. So the system of medical care in the 18th century was very complicated and unregulated, and very much a hodgepodge of practices, a hodgepodge of practitioners. But by and large, in terms of the primary caregivers, they were actually enslaved healers. So they were enslaved women and enslaved men who were the primary healers. And that comes under threat by the 1780s. But I'll go back just a little bit. So before the 1780s, there was, or at least before 1820, there was no licensing body, even though I sort of use the term hospitals in the book.
Yes.
It's nothing in comparison to what we have today. So
Absolutely.
that sort of language is a language that I use, but it needs to be very clear that this is very rudimentary, this is really very hodgepodge. And so what happens is that the planters, the owner of the estate, lives in England. The manager, the overseer, resides on the property, and healthcare, for the most part, is a purview of enslaved people. Now, what happens is that from the 1780s and just a little bit before that, so the 1760s, which is a moment when enslavers in Jamaica, as well as in North America as well, were experimenting with changes in the plantation regime. And they were experimenting with changes in the plantation regime for several reasons, but one of which was a cost control method. And so there were discussions around, okay, if we indeed sort of shift away from importing laborers, is it actually cheaper? So on very few plantations in the 1760s, 1750s, you had some doctors and surgeons who would migrate from England and would, serve these plantations. On the plantations, however, the doctor primarily did surgery in terms of, dressing of bruises, delivering of babies. That was, again, the control of enslaved women. The doctors who arrived in the Caribbean were in very small numbers. They were in very small numbers because they had alternatives. And your work sort of talks about the slave trade and working for the Royal African Company, the East India Company, or even the Army and the Navy were much better alternatives for doctors in the 18th century. So there were very few European doctors who wanted to go to the colonies. And some of them who did arrive in the colonies, they were not there necessarily to serve the interests of the laboring population. They were there for experimental purposes. They were, the language that some historians use is they were doctor scientists, because they were there to sort of investigate new medical treatments. They were there to experiment with pharmaceuticals, right? And so the primacy was not placed on the enslaved body. It was not placed on, the healthcare of the enslaved. It was very much placed on advancing their knowledge. But at the same time, for the few who arrived there, they didn't necessarily want to be there for the purposes of the enslaved. And so most of the healing takes place within the community of enslaved people by enslaved healers. Now this changes by the 1780s, and it's changing again because of pronatal abolitionism. It's changing because abolitionists and also the British Parliament is involved here. So what happens, and a major sort of source base that I use in my work is the parliamentary record. So one of the things that the British Parliament does is that it convenes several committees. And these committees pull individuals from various parts of the slave trading system, so from the slavery system, so from merchants, doctors, planters, you name it. So they were called before the Parliament, British Parliament, to testify. And in their testimony, you could sort of hear the disdain that they have for the enslaved healers. And so what is emerging in the 1780s is that before, even though the plantation system relies heavily on enslaved healers to treat and to heal the bodies of not just enslaved people, but also enslavers as well, the 1780s, you're seeing a shift away from that, at least in rhetoric. So the language is that, enslaved healers are quack. They don't know what they're doing. They're injecting medicine that is more damaging to the body than healing to the body. And so after the 1780s, there's a gradual shift away from enslaved healers as being the primary health caregivers on the plantations towards European doctors. And these are doctors who are coming out from schools in Edinburgh, in Scotland, Glasgow, from London, etc. And they're coming out again because they need practice, right? So they're coming out because much of their education is within the classroom, and so now they sort of need bodies to experiment on. So again, even though by the 1780s you do see a shift in terms of what they call professionally trained doctors or man midwives. Yes, man midwives. They still were not sort of placing enslaved people as the center of medicine. This was very much to serve a variety of purposes. But the bottom line is that it was very much a hodgepodge of practices and very much a tension, a contestation between European doctors on the one hand and enslaved healers on the other.
And to think about this in the 1700s, because we're not talking about really modern medicine, though they did consider themselves modern physicians, and they looked down on some of the traditional practices that the midwives had. Let's just talk about a few examples like this one. Bathing. Can you talk about, there was some tension over what the European doctors felt about bathing and what the enslaved midwives, and which kind of makes you wonder about the term modern medicine.
And this is one of my favorite sections in the book.
Same.
It's the fourth chapter for those of you who have the book. And it's my favorite for several reasons. So Sasha, I sort of heard you mention that you're also from the Caribbean.
Yes.
And one of the ways that the book came together, in addition to the secondary literature around different ways of treating the body, one of the things that sort of helped me to identify some of the discussion is through some of the practices that I remember in Jamaica. So bathing, for example, bathing in a variety of herbs, or making different kinds of tea. So if you have a headache, if you suffer from backache, whatever it is, there was some kind of a bath or there was some kind of a tea. And so, I sort of go into the archive remembering some of my own upbringing in Jamaica, and was able to see, wait a minute, there's something else that's happening here. And bathing becomes one of those critical issues or critical points of tension between enslavers and enslaved people. And it's a point of tension because European medicine, going back to ancient healers like Galen and Hippocrates, based their medical practices on humoral theory. And the theory was that the body had 4 different humors. So yellow bile, blood, for example, are the different humors. And it required balancing all 4 humors in the body to maintain health. So if one sort of humor dominated, so blood, which is understood to be moist and wet, dominated, then the body gets ill. And so in order to maintain the balance among all 4 humors, physicians would encourage their patients, for example, to avoid certain environmental conditions or avoid exerting the body in a particular way. So exercising, for example, could throw the humoral balance of the body out of balance, right? Bathing could also disrupt the humoral balance. And it wasn't just bathing, it was whether you bathe in hot water or cold water, or whether you bathe in it was a sea bath or a river bath. So those different kinds of bathing had implications for the humoral balance of the body. And if you upset the humoral balance of the body, then that's how they account for illnesses. When European doctors encountered enslaved people, what they're encountering are people who see bathing as essential to their healing techniques. So among the stories and rituals that I write about in the book are the bathing practices of enslaved women, and different bathing practices from the moment conception occurred, or they were aware that conception occurred, right throughout the pregnancy to the point of delivery and after delivery. And so there were a variety of bathing techniques, and the herbs would also change as well that they would use in terms of bathing. And so what's happening in terms of the tension is that European doctors have this convoluted idea about what bathing can do to the body, the negative effects that bathing can have in the body, and they're now encountering enslaved women who actually see bathing as essential to protecting their body. And so what happens is a real contestation between enslavers, enslaved doctors and enslaved people about how exactly should a pregnant body be treated, whether or not a pregnant body should be bathed, whether or not the body of a child, an infant, should even be bathed as well.
One of the things that I think struck me reading that chapter also was that despite whether you're on the side of, cleanliness and bathing would be a good thing or not to, was that these women who appear from the outside not to have any agency, not to have any power, believed to their core what they thought was healthy for their bodies and what they knew was healthy for their babies, and they went ahead and found ways to do it despite what the doctors were telling them, which made me think in terms of pregnant women now. And you'll know this for being on the front lines, that you're not talking about, in the most case with pregnancy, somebody who's in horrible pain and saying, sure, just do whatever. When you're so sick and you go to the doctor, at a certain point, I don't care how educated you are, you're just going to say, fine, do whatever, because just get me out of this pain. You want to get pregnant, or you're having an easy pregnancy, that's a different dynamic of midwife patient or doctor patient in terms of what women will do on their own. And so how, in terms of, what do you see in terms of women saying, well, I have my own way of doing something, and working out those tensions?
Well, I'm so glad that you brought up the bathing and some of the rituals that the enslaved women tried to keep, and how that transcends today. So one of the things that I think we've made advancements in the medical society, for the most part, is recognizing women's autonomy and having more respect for religious and cultural beliefs, and understanding that sometimes we can, and for the most part we can, when it comes to pregnancy at least, hear the voices of the women and the family and try to understand the basis. Does it really interfere with the pregnancy, the big picture, this woman's pregnancy, her health in general? Or can we allow the family, the community, the culture to engage in the practices that they hold near and dear to their hearts? I think this is one of the ways that we've made some advancements, and we continue to make advancements and learn from our own clients. And I'm so glad that you referenced it, because I remember the bathing. And as we learn from each other as humans and continue to increase our respect for each other as humans, and really hear what we're saying to each other, and really does that change this scheme for us in the medical field or not? Can we just allow them to be and to hold on to what preserves their dignity, their culture, their community, and engage them, and maybe we can learn from them.
And engagement.
And engage.
Builds the trust.
It builds the trust. Something that we broke many, many years ago.
And Carolyn, I have a feeling you're like, wait, I know about this. I can talk about the legacy of I mean, you're in the thick of this now.
Yeah.
So can you chime in and just talk about some of these customs and African healing? And
Well, in West Africa, looking at the different traditions, that women are passing down their medical knowledge within the female line in a lot of the Gold Coast communities in particular. And what you see, as opposed to when you get to the plantations in the Americas, what you see in a lot of the West African slave trading zones is how important it is for West African medicine to be used by Europeans. They are writing about it, they are looking for it, they are trying to understand how is it that African people are able to stay alive when they are dying in such great numbers, the British themselves, other Europeans themselves, because they're in a very different disease environment and they're encountering tropical diseases that they are unfamiliar with, they don't know how to cure, they don't know how to treat. And so you see in the records a lot things like, we believe that there are many important medicines to be found here, which we see the natives using with great success in pharmacy as well as surgery. Or they talk about different plants and things that are being used. And so in some of the research that I do, I've been trying to sort of collect and put together sort of what are these medical practices, what kinds of plants, what kinds of materia medica are they writing about and using. And there's some really interesting things that come up through the archives, things like velvet tamarind, which is, we know it's an antimalarial, we know that it has very important antioxidant properties as well, that some of the medicines that are being used in West Africa during this period of time are efficacious from our own point of view. From the point of view of the period, 18th century and earlier, in the early modern period, doctors are observing these medicines and seeing that the treatments are efficacious, and saying that African people are able to cure things that they don't know how to cure, and that when they sort of run out of their own medical resources, that they have to rely on West Africans. And so they have enslaved West African women and men at these forts and factories. They're called doctors, doctresses, fetish women as well, because of the spiritual nature of the care. And so seeing that sort of medical world and how differently, how things change when you get to the Americas, because there is that sense of control that we have, now British and other Europeans believe they have knowledge that is going to, protect them and protect the enslaved. Whereas in the West African slave trading zones, I mean, for the British, their life expectancy was 4 to 5 years. I mean, their lives were very short, and they ran out of doctors and European sourced medicines quite quickly, and they also deteriorated in the sun. So they had to make use of this knowledge, and so some of these women that are coming over, they were doing this healing labor. They were part of these practices.
I mean, among the things, so several things struck me while you were sharing there, and one of the things that I think needs to be said is the ways in which the racialization of Africans and enslaved people then shifts the value of their healing techniques. And we mentioned before how the coming of European doctors and their attempt to then displace enslaved healers, and how that then gives rise to a racialization of enslaved people's practices. And so instead of seeing the value, it's interesting that in their treatise they write about these practices, but at the same time they then dismiss them as being superstitious. They dismiss the women in particular, as damned old wenches who have no idea essentially of what they're doing. So race then sort of enters into the foray to then create an additional layer of undermining the kind of healing techniques that these enslaved Africans had. And the other interesting piece where it becomes gendered as well is the ways in which African healing and African practices were centered around maternal, or at least, the maternal line. So knowledge gets passed down among women. So it's the community of women, which is very different among the Europeans because it's very patriarchal, and anything that's centered around maternity and the maternal line it's less than, right? But it's interesting how there are two very different kinds of value system, and then Europeans then will disregard that kind of maternal line of descent. So again, another kind of level layering there of the kind of contests that are taking place.
And isn't it interesting that many of these roots, and my grandmother always had a bush for something. There was always something boiling that was like green grass in a pot. And it was to heal a lot of things, common gas. But many of these things, the root of it is in many of the common everyday remedies that we see in pharmacies right now. But they were in their purest form in my grandmother's backyard and in her pot for the bush. So it's interesting how all of this history has come forward, and now we bottle it, put it in pills, make a probiotic for it, and they were in their most purest form back then, yet the enslaved were considered not intelligent or less than, or not capable of even that intelligent thought to come to pick something in a foreign land from when they were, that could heal themselves and their survival, increase their rates of survival, and increase their rates of being able to produce healthy children and more generations. Very interesting. I love it.
You mentioned in the beginning the first letter that talked about giving women a break so that, during their pregnancy. But then you talk in the book about how do we punish pregnant women? What do we do about, which I think shows sort of this shift in agency of the concern is for the workers, the future workers that these women are holding, their vessels. So I'll let you talk about, they weren't free from getting punished throughout their pregnancy, and they weren't relaxing during their pregnancy. They still had to work, and then there were issues of, they misbehaved, or they were off doing their own healing thing, and they had to get punished for that. Can you explain some of how they protected the baby but didn't care about the woman?
So just a note of caution, this is not a book to read a paragraph and run with it, because if you read a paragraph and run with it, and you don't sort of read 10 paragraphs in later, you sort of miss the nuances of the work, which is on the one hand, just as the abolitionists had done in terms of, saying you need to protect the women's labor. Yes, you need to protect the women's reproductive labor, but it's for a very specific purpose, which is for prolonging slavery, for prolonging the plantation system. So if you don't sort of read further, you miss that part. But as it pertains to the labor roles of enslaved women and their punishment, one of the arguments that I make is that the intention was not to remove punishment, but to make punishment so effective that you cajole the women but protect their body.
Right.
There was one doctor, Dr. John Williamson, who was testifying before the British Parliament, and I mentioned to you before that one of the things that the British Parliament had done in response to abolitionism was to convene these investigative committees. And John Williamson was testifying before the British Parliament, and he was, testifying in these glowing terms of how he was protecting women's pregnancy by, when they were disobedient or whatever it is that they had done, when they were being whipped, the enslavers would cut a hole in the ground, place their belly, bury their bellies in it, and then whip them on their buttocks or on their back as a way to protect the infant, and as a way to protect the body of the woman, of course, the belly of the woman. And so in that instance, it's not the absence of punishment, but punishing in such a way that it did not damage the property in terms of the enslaved woman or the future property, which is the enslaved child. Another kind of punishment that I write about in the book is the incarceration or confinement, more to the time, the confinement of enslaved women. So the doctors and the planters, and they're working together at various points, they would calculate that, it was actually more effective to confine the women than whip them. And confinement meant that they had these small huts that they would build, or even just the trash houses or the stock room, where they would lock the women in those stock rooms for a couple of hours, half day, or at particular times of the day. So they would lock them away, and what that did was that they would lock them away in the evening time when it was time to be with their families or when it would be time to be with their community. And in one of the testimonies and writings of the enslavers, they say this is more effective because they hate to be deprived of that time with their family and with their community members. So yes, whipping is effective, but the real effective way of getting the women to labor and to be obedient is to lock them away, to take away something that they value. And what they valued was spending time with their community. So yes, there are changes and there is reform, but we have to be careful. And the thing that I do in the book is I'm very, very careful not to say this is reform for the better, because there can in fact be reform that takes the women back. And in this case, what we're seeing are insidious forms of punishment that actually works to control the labor and the life of these women.
Yes, and that was a very difficult chapter to read, I'll say, but important because I do think it shows that it was, Carolyn, you were talking earlier about the bodies before they came to the islands, and it was just about it was dehumanizing in terms of just the labor, and I think this talks to the same issue in terms of the woman's body was just the vessel, and what to do just to get that next generation of labor and keep that next generation healthy in some.
But it's interesting, there is a statement that you want to keep the next generation healthy. However, they didn't provide proper clothing or allow a woman proper time to feed, or as I think you said, suckle their young in the book. And the women went right back to work in the field and oftentimes had to bring their babies with them in these conditions. And then they expected these children to live. So really, what value did they really place on the vessel?
And the idea of motherhood, which you do such a great job of tracing in the book as you move towards looking at the children, their stories. In the slave trade, some of the stories that I come across in the records, some of them are also in the parliamentary testimony, and some of them are in correspondence, have to do with how mothers are treated on slave ships. And in contrast with what was going on in the Americas, they really did not want to have mothers and children on these ships. And the reality is that they would have babies that would be crying, that wouldn't eat, that they couldn't control. And in one instance, there was a little child, 2 years old, kept crying, refused to eat, and the mother kept trying to get the child to eat. And you're on a slave ship, and there's violence and brutality everywhere. And so the ship's captain kept trying to force the child to eat, and was so frustrated at one point that he poured boiling water on the little child, and the child died in a couple of days. But what the slave captain did was he forced the mother to throw the child's body overboard, and beat her and beat her and beat her until she would do that, getting rid of this child's body. And the idea that motherhood was something that this slave captain was thinking, this is like a litter, animals, just throw the child overboard. The way that they looked at women, and how old, how long the idea of sort of deviancy and, in ideas about African women and African descended women, goes all the way back to the 17th century and probably earlier. The writings of travel narratives that show us how African women are being portrayed as being socio-sexually deviant, as having sort of monstrous bodies, as being able to give birth, effortlessly, and then go back to their business just like an animal. And
we're talking about women about what age? Because they were mothers at a very young age.
Young
so we're
age.
talking
So
girls. When we
we're
talk
talking
about
girls,
we're talking
yes.
girls.
We should clarify
Yes.
that, because
Yes.
the enslavers then started to put value on the African women, which ones were better to reproduce,
Yeah.
and at what age were they better to reproduce. And so they didn't want little children, they didn't want them too young, because if you were younger than 10, then you were, or 12, you were more subject to being raped or abuse, some sort of sexual abuse from your own enslavers or the men on the slave ships. And then, but the best ages for you to get, and they had no records of these women's or these young girls' age. They would just go according to their body parts, how their breasts look, and they would examine their body parts and make an estimation of their age. So the best ages started from 15, I think, and they were bringing these young girls over with the purposes of them reproducing healthy, and then you got rewards if you could reproduce more than 6 children. You may not be able to work in the fields anymore. You can do much lighter work, and we have to clarify what lighter work really means. And very few women could reproduce live, healthy 6 children under those conditions, because the ones that died weren't counted.
I think I need to bring you along with me. You've read. Thank you.
And the same name, so it kind of works. It does.
We'll do a Sasha show.
I'm just going to ask 1 or 2 more questions and then open it up. But I know breastfeeding and encouraging, or people wonder how long is an issue now. And so I want to hear from both of you, because there was like a pseudoscience around, or who determined, what was the tension with how long women should breastfeed and what they should and whose babies they should be breastfeeding, and then you can talk about, we'll just get this Sasha and Sasha's show going on breastfeeding.
Well, that's a great follow-up question, because I wanted to add, from your point, Carolyn, about the separation of mother and child, and how it sort of connects to breastfeeding. So I think you sort of bringing that up at this point is really great. So what happens, and link it back to the abolitionists. So what happens is that enslaved women would nurse their children for anywhere between 24 to 36 months. And abolitionists were now proposing to shorten that to 6 months, or between 6 and 12 months. The doctors and the planters on the ground also agree that breastfeeding should be limited to about 6 months. And there were several reasons for cutting that 24 to 36 month breastfeeding to 6 to 12 months. From the perspective of the planters, it made children too attached to their mothers. It made mothers and children too attached to one another. And that was bad for the business that they were in. It was bad, to get young children to learn to be hardy, tough workers. And they needed them to be hardy, tough workers from a very early age. So you can't have tender babies, you can't have tender children that will be crying for their mother. So the earlier weaning was set in, it's the better in terms of producing productive, industrious laborers. From the perspective of doctors, early weaning was encouraged as a way to get women to produce more children. So they were theorizing that breastfeeding acted as a natural contraceptive. And so if these women were nursing their children for 24 months, 36 months, it means that there will be a spacing of their children for about 2 to 3 years. So you're not going to be having another child for another 2 to 3 years. So the doctors were encouraging planters to limit breastfeeding to about 6 months if you do in fact want to grow the population at a relatively rapid rate. The abolitionists also were echoing some of these points about labor concern and about reproducing the population. But the interesting point about the abolitionists, and comes back to the point where we started about taking a second look at the British abolitionists, is that they thought that they needed to separate mother and child from an early age because the children were the future of the colonies. The children were the future of the colonies for several reasons. One, obviously, is a labor concern. But two, they were hoping that at a distant point down in the future, those children would be able to be acculturated to British cultural values and British cultural norms. So if you allow these children to hang around their mothers and their communities for too long, then what happens is that they will begin to imbibe and adopt all of those negative Afro-Jamaican cultural values that the abolitionists wanted to stamp out. So if you separate mother and children from their communities early enough, and you get the missionaries in the colonies early enough, then the colonies had a better chance of raising children who would become potentially subject citizens at a very distant time in the future. So each of these groups had a very different reason for wanting to impose a shortened lactation period for the women.
I'm glad you brought that up, because then you start to see how they start to develop the racism amongst people of color themselves, so amongst Africans, in that there was more of a value placed on certain babies versus others. So ones that were slave owners' children were removed from their mother very young and being raised by the missionaries in hopes that in future generations they would marry mixed children and produce a new generation that would then govern their own people of color that were darker, had wider noses and curlier hair. So you start to see this infusion of self-hate amongst people of color.
Yeah, so you're sort of seeing a hierarchy being imposed. So one of the proposals that the abolitionists made, and again, it's a very elaborate proposal, is to make a distinction between African-born and those who were Creole, and also make a distinction between those who had been born of parents who were from African descent and European descent. And the proposal, or part of the proposal, is that those children who were born in the colonies, or those children who were born of African and European parentage, would then be sent to schools in England, right? And they would be sent to schools in England where they would learn to speak English, where they would learn the laws and the manners of the English, and then they would be sent back to the colonies after they were married, because marriage again becomes critical here in terms of creating the kinds of society that the the abolitionists had envisioned, right? And so what you're having is this proposal to impose a hierarchical structure that would then gradually transition, because what the proposal here is not an immediate transition from slavery to freedom, but a very gradual one. And in this gradual transition from slavery to freedom, you need some to be leaders, and the leaders would be the Creole-born, as they would call them, or those who were children of European and African ancestry.
And I think, because, wow, we keep going on and on, I'm not giving everyone a chance. I'd like to open it up. No, this is wonderful. I would just like to give people a chance in the audience to join the conversation, to ask questions or comments of any of our panelists in terms of historically or what's going on now.
I have a question for Sasha Turner. So I, unfortunately, haven't read your book. I'm not very familiar with slavery in the British colonies. So I was wondering, like in the U.S., I've read Birthing a Slave about Marion Sims, which speaks to a lot of the same thing that you're discussing. And so I was wondering, when the abolitionists came in and kind of the enslaved women lost, I think it was perceived that they lost their reproductive rights. How did they subvert that? Because like within like Working with Slaves, I read that, through using different herbs, different techniques, the enslaved women kind of tried to retain their reproductive rights. Particularly, I don't know if in the British colonies they had this, but in the US, you had the chattel slavery, like the birthing, I don't want to call them birthing centers, it sounds too nice, but basically birthing farms, essentially. And so I don't know if they had that similar thing in the British colonies, but there was this kind of attempt to subvert their control over their reproduction and space it out, or not bring children into slavery. So I was wondering kind of after how they did that.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. So the way in which I discuss resistance in the book is twofold. So I discuss it in the traditional sense of gynecological resistance, which is a language that is used in terms of women who practice infanticide or abortion, or use various methods of contraception, herbal-based contraception, or sort of more mechanical instrumental means of preventing pregnancy, as a way to resist both the commodified claims that enslavers are placing on their reproductive ability, and also this new kind of moral claim that abolitionists are claiming on reproduction. And so there is a part of the book that discusses that. But the other part of the discussion, I think the more extensive discussion of the book, is to make it very clear that 1780 marks a period of significant change. It marks a period of significant change because of all of what we've discussed in terms of this new pronatal abolitionism that's been imposed on the women. What it does is that it encourages, or it motivates planters to do things like build hospitals or build weaning houses. And the weaning houses were the spaces where women were meant to take their children, or forced to take their children, as a way of enforcing that 6-month weaning deadline. And so what I did was to re-examine a common part of the literature which talks about women who were, or women who did not run away. So part of the argument in the literature is that women did not run away because they had greater responsibility for family. So they would be the ones who would be the pillar of support for those in flight. Now what I was seeing in the runaway records in newspaper were women described as running with infants at the breast. So the discussion, or the advertisement would say, you know, Suki ran away with her 2-month-old still at the breast. Ibu Venus ran away with her 3 days old daughter or child still at the breast. And what I was seeing is not so much a connection between generalized running away in terms of wanting to escape slavery in an abstract sense, but instead women who were running away perhaps temporarily to then exert some control over nursing. So if they were absent for a day, if they were absent for a few hours, that gave them a space to be able to nurse their children. And so what I'm seeing are, you know, large scale numbers of women being reported to be absconding from the plantation, not necessarily permanently, but it was very instructive that there were so many women between 1780 and 1820, which is the high point of the period that my book examines, that there were so many women being described as having children at the breast. And so I'm sort of seeing it as a response to this attempt now to restrict and to control how long women could nurse their children. So the exertion of control takes on a variety of forms. Yes, in the traditional sense that we're used to discussing in terms of, you know, women limiting their fertility, but on the other part of it, women wanted to have their children. Women wanted to be able to protect their children. I think there's something there that has to be discussed further in terms of the ways in which women are protecting their children and how the protection of children too can constitute resistance.
Anyway, I can talk about it now.
Yes.
This horrific behavior just takes the luster off of our Christian holy week for me.
Oh, well, should have waited a week, I guess.
But interestingly, this is the last day of Black Maternal Health Week in the United
Ah.
States. So as a Catholic, a practicing Catholic that provides abortion care, it adds a lot to this holy week for me.
No, I wasn't criticizing. I'm just saying that, you know, it's just another example of Christians doing horrible things. Not to come, I'm not to.
Welcome to history.
But what a wonderful thing to be at the very end of Black Maternal Health.
Oh, yeah, I salute you for doing it.
And I guess I would just say that, you know, some of these abolitionists who you've done such a good job of complicating and showing us how humanitarianism has a dark side to it and is embedded sometimes in devious economic and commercial priorities and privileges. At the same time, you know, when you think about people like Thomas Clarkson, for example, who is gathering information about the slave trade, he's got terribly problematic and disturbing beliefs in terms of race, but you know, he's on horseback traveling 35,000 miles to gather stories and evidence about the slave trade, to get firsthand accounts of what happened on board these ships, to the point that he's so disturbed by what he hears that he has a nervous breakdown and has to drop out of the movement before the 1807 bill is passed. And it's such a complicated history, and it does give us pause, and I appreciate your comment.
So, good evening, everyone. So I'm Ken Harris. I'm from the Community Foundation for Great Behavior, and I'm the director of the Federal Healthy Start program, Healthy Start, which has been around this country since 1991, and I happen to be at one of the original 15 sites back in 1991, and today we have 100 programs across the country. So in addition to Black Maternal Mortality Week, it is also 2019, which is the 400-year anniversary of the first time people were brought to Jamestown and enslaved. And so at the Healthy Start on a national perspective, we've been looking at this issue for 30 years. We're saying, look, in a few years it's going to be 2019, and when we look at infant mortality and Black infant mortality, although we've made some gains, the disparity remains. And we talk about the impact of racism. And we had a conference earlier this year with fathers, men and fathers, and Christopher Johnson was there, who was the husband of Kira Johnson, who died, and he was leading the bill around Black maternal mortality. And when you look at that story in today's conversation, thank you all so much. Thank you so much. I was looking forward to coming here. But I'm just thinking the cost on Black bodies in this country. And so when we talk about this history, it's important to lift it up, because women today, women of color, Black women, their voices are still not being heard. And that's what I hear within Healthy Start. And I think Kira Johnson, Christopher's wife, there was blood in her bag early on. And she saw when she was lying after delivery. And they didn't pay attention to her until over 12 hours later. By that time, she died. And he is the son of Judge Hatcher. She was at the hospital. He has an aunt that's a nurse. She was at the hospital, a Black woman, telling them as well, something's going on. And so the stories that I've heard from Black women over the 25 years I've been here is that their voices are still not heard. And I hear that in some of the conversation here. So can we take a moment to speak about that? Because that brings it right to today. Because there are Black women and women of color struggling, telling their stories, speaking up in these institutions, but no one is listening to them. And they're dying.
Maybe you can talk about some
Can
of
I
the
talk about that?
organizations.
So in New York, and thank you for saying that I'm part of the Governor's Task Force on Maternal Mortality and Racial Disparities in New York. So the governor took a lead on maternal mortality and racial disparities in New York. We can talk about why he did that, but he convened this task force, and I was very honored as a midwife to be co-lead and still be a co-lead of it. But as we convened the task force and we sat around the table as experts in perinatal health care, it's all the same people that we see, so it's like preaching to the choir, right? And so we sat back and we thought, well, really, if we're going to make change, and of course we had a timeline to make change, we have to take a step back and go out into the community and find out what is really going on. We can look at statistics. We know about our health care. We study science. So we did listening sessions across the state. And it's interesting, from Brooklyn to Buffalo, women say the same thing, Black, white, and otherwise, that their voices aren't being heard. They feel disrespected, even more so for women of color and Black women. It doesn't matter your title. And so one of the reasons why I do what I do is when I take this lovely suit off and I put a ponytail on and jeans and sneakers, I'm still just another Black girl walking down the street. Doesn't matter how many letters I have after my name. So when I walk in the door to preconceived notions, oh, it's another Black girl. Doesn't matter, I come from, my mom's a physician. Doesn't matter. But what we need to do is have basic respect of humans. And I think from that task force, we were able to step back and realize, wow, because the women said they generalized everyone in the medical field. It didn't matter if you were a doctor, a nurse, midwife, or a housekeeper. We all wore scrubs. They just felt generalized disrespect. And they didn't feel comfortable in where they were birthing and how they were birthing and that they were being heard. And all of their families felt the same way. And what that does is that goes back into the community and you hear stories. So as we listened to women, we decided, wow, one of the things we have to do is hear from those that are already in the grave. Hear their stories. What can we extrapolate from their stories without fear of litigation, right? And use their stories to respect these women that have given their lives and their bodies and bring that forward in healthcare. and really make changes in healthcare. What really went on, right? So it's something that's starting. You're absolutely right, and thank you for saying it, because we're learning. We're learning, and I'm hoping that we're making change, albeit not fast enough for me, but that we're making change. Because again, if we don't respect basic humans, which is one of the things in your book, then we will continue to perpetuate the problem that we're seeing. 400 years, nothing really has changed.
Thank you for that. And I think I was speaking at a conference a couple of weeks ago and dealt with the same issue. Healthy Start has 100 sites around the country. They represent urban, rural, tribal, and border communities. And it was discovered from doing some research that over the 100 Healthy Starts, about 80% of them are in communities that have historical redlining.
Yes.
So again, so we know what happens in the conditions of these families that are there. But I thank you for saying that, because it's important that we step back and listen. And in listening also, I tell people to do this too. Shut up. Because that's when you hear the stories from the past. And again, it's about just respecting people. So thank you all for this terrific work. I can't wait to read the book. I'm appreciative of this moment from all of you, because it's about freedom. And we're committed to freedom for these families. Thank you.
So there's one sort of plug that I'll plug in apart from my book, which is as a historian to say why history matters and why history is important. And we're sort of in another cycle again of the decline in interest in history, the decline in history majors in universities and high schools, etc. And I think having these kinds of conversations and sort of seeing the value of history and how history can then be used is sort of a moment to say, this is why history is important. I mean, I know you could speak about the work that you're doing here in the community in terms of the training of medical doctors. So what kind of training are they receiving? Are they being exposed to this kind of a history or history within their medical school training? What can we sort of learn from history? How do we sort of use history and make it integral to other disciplines? And you think about reformers, so this is also an age of activism. We are campaigning for prison reform, prison abolition, police reform, so many different kinds of reforms. Again, what can we learn from the abolitionists? So in my work, I didn't necessarily set out to be cruel to the abolitionists. Someone accused me of being very cruel to the abolitionists. I didn't set out to be cruel to them. I just went where the evidence led. So I was just, reading through their papers, and this is how the dots were connected, that it was not such a simple story of, good guys, of saints and humanitarians. There's a little bit more complexity there. And I think, for reformers, we can sort of take lessons from these abolitionists and see what are their blind spots. So we talked about this before, the abolitionists, yes, they sort of really led the charge in terms of campaigning for the abolition of the slave trade and slavery, but they had blind spots. They had significant blind spots. And I think, again, centering history in various curricula, whether it's medical training, social science, whatever, I think history, I'm sort of running the charge here, for history should really become critical for all of us.
Well, I'll just give a little shout out. John Warner and sitting there, and I have to say, when I was in medical school here, we had history of medicine mandatory. Nothing's mandatory in the medical school, but it felt mandatory. And I did find, I couldn't read the whole thing, but I found this 8-page letter I wrote home, handwritten, really small print. I was just ranting. This is what I should be doing. History. I got more out of the history class than I am in medical school. And then I was just complaining, so I just shoved it back in the file. But I will say that we do have a good history department here in the medical school that we should be proud of. So I'm just going to, go ahead.
Well, no, go ahead. You want
Nope.
We don't have any mic, right? Okay. It's interesting. I was going to ask about these abolitionists, and then Carolyn sort of answered it before I asked. But then, first of all, thanks for that call for history. All for that. But, and after these comments, I almost didn't want to drag us back to the past because this is such a current problem. But who were these abolitionists? Especially in Jamaica. Who were they? I mean, you mentioned Thomas Clarkson, who was famous and so important over time. But who were they? And are they actually in Jamaica? Are they, how are they affecting all this control? What, that's, to me, that was one of the most amazing things about your book, too. And to the other Sasha, at what point does this current problem especially have to be affected? Is it in medical training? Is it in maternity wards? When women are being disrespected, when women are not being listened to, when women don't feel comfortable birthing, is it a circumstance that has just grown as part of the modern medical apparatus that is so bureaucratic, so commercial, so whatever it is? At what point can this be affected the most if there is to be reform? Is it right in that maternity ward, or is it in the training, or is the answer all of the above?
So I'm gonna let you start.
But who are these abolitionists, and how are they, how are they doing this complicated, messy work?
Yeah. So the interesting thing is that the abolitionists were not on the ground in Jamaica.
Okay, yeah, I
They
didn't
were
think
not.
so. Right,
They were in England.
Right.
But this comes to what we talked about earlier in terms of how knowledge gets circulated and how even enslaved women themselves are very much aware of what's going on in England. And they are aware, and the knowledge of abolitionism is circulating by various mechanisms. The colonial newspapers, or newspapers that circulated in the colonies, were not all printed in the colonies. So you had British newspapers that were accessible in the colonies. So the planters were reading British newspapers, and so they knew the debates. They were very familiar with the debates that were going on in the British Parliament and in the streets of England as a whole, right? So the newspapers are critical. But the other piece is that the British Parliament too is putting pressure on the planters to reform. So you have orders in councils that are sent first to the Crown Colony territories, and also to territories like Jamaica that has an assembly to suggest here are the reforms that should be put in place. So the British Parliament, through it wasn't the Colonial Office at the time, I've forgotten the Secretary of the colonies, who are putting pressure on the planters to implement these reforms. So all of these conversations are taking place in England, but there is quite a sophisticated mechanism of circulating knowledge or getting information from the metropole into the colonies. There are specific individuals that I look at in the book. So one of the things that I do, and I'm sort of following in Thomas Holt's work. So Thomas Holt's work was very influential for me, which is he insists that we make a distinction between parliamentarian abolitionists and ordinary abolitionists. So the everyday people who were campaigning in the streets, those who were signatories to the petitions, those who were saying we're not going to eat sugar because sugar is sprinkled with the blood of the enslaved, right? So he insists that we make a distinction between those who were in Parliament making the argument, like William Wilberforce, who was making this very clear and strategic argument about the way in which abolition should unfold, distinct from people who had either religious conviction or moral conviction and were campaigning out in the streets. And so my work centers around the parliamentary abolitionists, because that's where the real meat is. That's where you're seeing this very elaborate discussion around how abolition should unfold, not as an immediate policy, but as a gradual policy. And the newspapers, so you had the newspapers that would report what went on in Parliament. So William Wilberforce gives a speech before Parliament, the newspapers run with it. The newspapers in England run with it the next day, and those newspapers are arriving in the colonies. The House of Commons then sends out an order to the colonies to say, here are the resolutions that should be adopted. So there is quite a sophisticated machinery of passing knowledge from the metropole into the colonies.
And they always use that language of amelioration.
Yes.
Amelioration.
Yeah, I stay away from it. I stay
No,
away
I
from
know.
the language of amelioration. And I hinted at this before, that amelioration suggests that it's improving, it's getting better. And I think, there were certain respects that improve. So, Sasha, you mentioned the clothing allowances that enslaved people could get. So there were marginal increases. So they would give women who had children extra rations, so extra food, extra clothing, perhaps a house that was better situated in terms of its environment, as a way again to motivate them. So better, yes, but in the larger scheme of things, I would really hesitate to say this was ameliorative for them.
And for your second part of your question, that was when does this change and where do we begin the change? And I'm glad you brought up history, because it's so important. Because if we don't understand how this even started, how do we really affect change going forward? And so that's one of the things that we as a task force learned as well. And I hope that we continue on this pathway, because there was a discussion about how are we training our providers, not just in medical schools, nursing school, and midwifery, but understanding the history of this country, that midwifery and our cultural norms of people of color were abolished too, were stripped from our women and cultures and family. And to re-embrace that and to understand how that came to be. How does it come to be that now I'm going to put this out there, I'm a child of a physician, so don't be mad at me. How did it come to be that we are our society, the only society that physicians are the only ones, are the gold standard for providing maternal child care? However, we are the only country like ourselves that have physicians as a gold standard for maternal child care, and we have one of the worst maternal child health outcomes. When we compare us to Britain, Australia, Finland, that have maternal mortality rates of 3, 4 per 100,000. The difference, gold standard, midwifery care is a gold standard. Women are allowed to birth and they're allowed to rest. Yes. They get care at home. They're valued. Their children are valued. We encourage lactation for a longer period of time. We pay them to stay home. We pay their partners to be with them. We encourage their families to surround them and their communities to surround them. We don't keep them in the hospitals for 2, 3, and 4 days and inflict another infection on them. We allow them. Princesses deliver 12 hours later. Here's my baby. I'm now going home to rest and to feed and to breastfeed. We never talk about that. We never talk about who was with her in labor, who helped her along to get to the point. It was a midwife. Where there's a place for physicians, and there is a time, and that's why we should all be together, listening to women, being with women, being with families, together, supporting our own community.
Question way in the back. Can you
We can't hear you.
shout?
Shout it out.
Oh, that's a great question.
So, yeah. So she wanted to know about the writing process. How did Professor Turner have a book that historians are saying, wow, I learned a lot and this was great, and then those like me who knew about the history of childbirth but not about slavery in Jamaica, and those who don't know anything can read this book and say, wow, this is a great read. So we want to know about your writing process.
That's a $1,000,000 question.
How do you get a Pulitzer? How do you get a Pulitzer?
So there are a number of things that I really wanted to do in the book. I wanted to center the women. What I was seeing in the archive is that it wasn't a simple story, and I didn't want to write a simple black and white story. I wanted as much as possible to convey all the complexities that I was seeing in the archive and that were eye-opening for me. I wanted to be able to convey that in a book. I also wanted the book to be able to be accessible to people in Jamaica. I'm Jamaican, I grew up in Jamaica, and one of the most satisfying things is going home to talk about my book. So I wrote it, thinking about the women and thinking about the community from which I emerged, and would they be able to understand a story that is essentially about them. There are some moments when it does sound academic-y, I think the introduction in particular, but as I go through, I really wanted, to be able to make sure that this could be accessed by, a popular audience, the people who I was writing the story about and their descendants.
And you speak and you give stories. I mean, I think it's the stories. You don't talk in generalities, and you have the statistics, but they're sprinkled through, and we're grabbed by the stories.
Yeah. So I like to center the stories for several reasons. One of which is I am so tired of knowing all the names of the planters and their plantations, and not enough of the story and the name of the individual enslaved people and enslaved women. And so one of the reasons why the book ends up being so detailed and filled with the stories is I really wanted to center those people that we don't hear as much about, or we don't sort of have the secondhand reference to their names. I still don't have secondhand references to all of their names, but I think going through the book and sort of seeing the repetition of different stories, it sort of brings home the point collectively that this is a story not about the institution of slavery, not about abolitionists, even though they have a major platform in the book, but ultimately it's really about the enslaved women and their communities.
And you give them such voice and depth.
But you also give voice and depth, and you pay respect to the ones that you could not find their names and the reasons why. You tell the reasons why you couldn't find the names of some of the enslaved and how they were counted even as non-citizens or citizens of Jamaica.
And another in the back, and just yell.
Hi, thank you guys so much for this wonderful talk, and this is kind of a question for anyone who wants to answer it. One of the things that really struck me in the beginning was discussing about how before the abolition kind of intervened in reproductive health care, the women really kind of came together in groups to go through pregnancy, to have that community, to rely on one another. And it seems as almost if when abolitionists came in, that was kind of taken away. So correct me if I'm wrong. But it seems as now, fast forward to the future, a lot of that kind of group care is emerging with group neonatal care, breastfeeding groups, group childrearing education classes. And so I was just wondering if any of you could speak to that. It seems like it was something that may have been vital to the way that things used to be, and something that is kind of coming back.
Don't we learn from our history, right? That to what you driving home, we found out they're not quacks.
So again, I'll sort of reference chapter 4, which is again one of my favorite. And one of the things that I did in writing that chapter was not just to sort of read about the birthing practices in Jamaica, but try to understand birthing practices in different cultural spaces like England, France at the same time. And one of the things that comes out is that there were not many differences, that there were far more commonalities than there were differences. So childbirth was very much centered in the community. It was centered in the community of women. And having women as caregivers was essential in Jamaica. It was also essential in France, essential in England. And what's happening in the case of Jamaica, it's the rise of abolitionism that's displacing that communal-based care. In England and France and Europe, it's more the professionalization of medicine that's displacing that care. So there is a clear distinction that I read, for example, between women who were in rural England versus women who were in London. And London was sort of the center of the rise of professional medicine in England, where there were far more women who were giving birth under the care of doctors or man midwives in England than there were in rural England. And the distinction is that those who gave birth in rural England, who were far removed from the center of the evolving professional medicine, still very much was based on a communal care. And so in seeing those commonalities, what becomes clear is just how significant communal care had been in different historical moments for childbirth practices, and not just the community, but a community of women who had, knowledge. So one of the things that comes out in the book is the importance of intergenerational connection and intergenerational knowledge transfer. And the women, again, that maternal line of knowledge transmission becomes really very critical, but it becomes anchored within the community. And this gets displaced, not immediately. My book doesn't talk about the change. It really changes significantly in the post-slavery period, because even though you had abolitionists who were making these proposals, you had doctors who were coming to the colonies, the women fought back. But interestingly, the planters too were not as eager to take on these doctors or build hospitals on their plantations, and they were not as eager for several reasons. One of which is the doctors were expensive, and you had these planters who were making these detailed calculations about whether or not they should pay these doctors, whether it was cheaper to pay or to give incentive to enslave healers rather than pay doctors. The planters themselves didn't trust the doctors, so you mentioned that there were different rates of mortality between Europeans and the different rates of efficacy between European healers and African healers. The planters themselves did not trust the doctors. They were still going to enslave healers, and they still preferred to use enslaved midwives as opposed to man midwives who were coming. So it wasn't an immediate transfer. Women fought back, women tried to preserve their autonomy, and also you had planters who still too were very wary of these doctors who were coming to the colonies.
But you also talked about just what's going on now, and maybe Sasha will disagree with me. I think there was a time when women weren't working. We weren't allowed in the workforce, that we found community in the 50s and 60s and 70s with each other and with family when we were giving birth. And I talked to women when I was working on my book in terms of change. And I spoke to Elizabeth Bing, who founded Lamaze, who said, there was a time in the 70s that she had to turn people away and find, everyone wanted to come and learn these birthing classes. And then all of a sudden in the 90s, when women are working, we have careers, we have other things to do, they'd be like, look, I really want to do this stuff, but can we just talk on the phone for 5 minutes at my desk? I'm not taking time. And I'm glad to hear that you're saying there's this upswing in community. I think maybe through social media, this would be one of the positive things I've been seeing. It's hard to take the time. Most women can't get that time off of work. And you don't have the time, if you have other kids, to really be joining in the communities that women might have had when they were stuck at home. But I do think that this is where the social media and online, because I found that there's support groups that women have, whether they've had a high-risk pregnancy or twins, that they're finding online. But I'm still not sure we're back to...
It's still isolation.
Yeah.
So, even though there's this increase in social media and all these platforms and social groups, you're taking away that human interaction. There's nothing like the human interaction. We cannot discredit that. And that's evidenced by our increased rate of maternal mortality. So what we know from the group prenatal care and community and that we're seeing and has been studied, and why it works so well, is that when you get communities and you get humans together and we interact, there's a sense of trust that's built, that human connection. And so you calm down, and if you study science enough, and hormones and the cascade of hormones that affect your body and how that transcends and affects your growing fetus, and those good feelings that we get from just even being here together, right, in this space, and how that would help nurture if I was pregnant with my baby. You cannot reproduce that online, on a support group online. And we've studied that, because in the past, there was better maternal outcomes in the United States. We've gone on a study down. So we must go back and learn our history. Maybe it's better for us to come together and be in groups and convene with each other as birthing people.
Well, I'll just give one example that when I gave birth to my first child in England, they have a system in England that you cannot opt out of, and I kind of wanted to because I was told that someone's going to be visiting my house every day after I got out of birth, and I just thought there was going to be this white starched person telling me everything I was doing wrong, and instead this like woman from the islands, funnily enough, in this like beautiful flowing skirt, stopped by, and she would chat every day. I tend to like obsess about when is she going to come, but she answered things about, where do I get diapers? What do I do? She brought a little, I think they've gotten more advanced, but she brought a little, the same thing that my fishmonger weighed the fish in, that's how she weighed my son. But they also were checking on, was the baby growing? Was he nursing? They came back in 6 weeks, and she said, now this isn't about the baby, it's about you. She came back and we sat on the floor together, and you would have thought we were just having a chit-chatty conversation. She had a checklist of postpartum depression. And if I had fallen into that category, she would have funneled me into the right services. They come back at 2 years, they make sure one of my friends' kids needed speech therapy, and I wasn't going to say anything, but then this woman came in and said, I think we should funnel your kid here. I moved back to the States, and about my son was 2 and I was pregnant, and 2 things happened. One is there was an article in the New York Times, just a little one, like on page 17, about a young woman in the Bronx who was 19, had given birth, and she was nursing the baby because breast is best, didn't realize she didn't have enough breast milk. The baby died because she was by herself in her house in the Bronx. And the article was about whether she should be held criminally responsible for the murder of this child. And I thought, this just wouldn't have happened in England. Like, someone would have been at her house weighing this baby, and someone would, like, it would have been a non-event. Someone would have said, oh, you can nurse, but here, we're gonna get you formula. It would have been a non-event. And then a few months after that, I gave birth to twins, and I did get out of the hospital because I was just like, I'm not staying here. The hair wasn't so great. But I left, and I honestly, like, I was so used to the English system. I was like, is this it? I'm just leaving? Like, is anyone, like, no one's gonna come over? It's just me and my babies. So I think that we need to implement, we're not gonna be able to have women all hanging at home with your mothers and sisters. It's not gonna happen, but we can make the communities like they had for me when I was in London.
So civilized healthcare is part of it.
Yeah.
Not monetized.
I think it's really important for us to remember that there are community members who are trying to hold on to those communal relationships in the form of doulas and child educators. And so we are here. What we are finding is that we want to work with women. A lot of women don't really understand the value of having that type of care. They're not used to it, so they don't even realize the importance of it. And then on the medical end, the medical providers are not really appreciating our role either. And so we need to learn how to somehow make relationships between the doulas and child educators and the medical providers so that we can then work together as a team, that continuity of care, where we have labor doulas or prenatal doulas and then postpartum doulas who can go back and communicate with the providers and let everybody know, like, what it is that we've seen, or the providers can say, she gave me a little bit of a hard time about taking her vitamin D. Can you check on that next time you go and visit? Some type of relationship so that these mothers can be taken care of properly, and we don't have that. There's like a break in the system.
There's a lot, and I could just nodding my head for a million different things, but one of the things that really strikes me here is the push and pull in the medical system that we have. Again, with the money and insurance and all of this kind of thing, and the legal piece. You know, people are so afraid of these old traditions. We're coming into this, what we've made for ourselves in the medical structures we have here.
Unfortunately, that's why we need to blow it up and start all over again. I'm in favor from the ground up, and we can't do that. So what we can do is do what we're doing is learn from each other, respect each other, and involve everyone from the community on up in the health care of our entire society, because it's not just moms and babies we're talking about, it's also partners and families.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Forgive me, it's a stupid question, but how, so I'm in the School of Nursing. To me, I'm very much in an echo chamber around the maternal mortality rates and infant mortality rates for Black women. But how well do we think this is known outside of these birthing circles? Because I look back at, I think it's becoming, for me at least, someone who was not in the medical field before going to nursing school, it sounds like it's becoming more transparent. People are speaking out a little bit more about their stories. I will sit here and say, and I know people in birthing communities throw knives, I'll say, for me, it kind of started with Serena Williams talking about her birthing experience. And I think about somebody like Serena Williams and how aware was she, not only of course of her physical condition of blood clots, which I knew through popular media, but how aware was she that she was at risk of, or how much she was at risk for death, just based on her race, taking her physical, her issue out of it, her physical issue out of it, how much she was at risk. And so I think about that and I just think, God, Serena Williams, who, I mean, I would imagine she was a VIP in the hospital, that she very much had her own staff, and that the ratio was very, very low. She had a history. I don't know, if you follow tennis, you knew Serena Williams had blood clots. And so to me, I'm like, anything, she should have been watched. I mean, just monitored more than you would monitor somebody who was fully healthy. But she's somebody who almost died while advocating for herself with a white husband, with money. You take somebody who doesn't have those resources, or even somebody who might have some of those resources, more than the next person, they have access. And so you look at those people and say, how will they survive this? I just wonder then, it made me question, well, how well known is this outside of birthing communities?
So we know that it doesn't matter how much money you have,
Right.
what your education is,
Right.
where you live, certain things just don't matter. You're a Black woman, that's it.
Yeah.
But I think that social media has made it so where people are more aware and hearing about stories. I've been a doula since 2001. 2001, everybody was like, what is it doing? And I was living in New York. In New York, more people had an understanding of what a doula was. When I came to Connecticut, people were totally just like, what is that, like a midwife? They didn't really know. But now, over the past 3 years, more people are starting to recognize that there's an issue and that you need more people, out there educating moms and assisting moms in the form of doulas or childbirth educators or whatever, because there's so much light shed on this mortality rate, whether it's infant mortality or maternal mortality or whatever it is. People are dying, and now everybody's like, oh my gosh, people been dying.
But I guess my question is really everybody like, oh my goch. I know us in the birthing community are like, oh my god, this is a problem.
No,
but how many people outside of that?
I will add, this is why this panel is so important, to combine history with modern medicine, and this is an example of that. Because reality is, for most of us in the United States, we don't know about the history of the colonies and the Americas and how we came to be. And if you really understand that and the multiple layers and how intricate this was, and this plan to create a new generation of people, and that impact that has sustained the legacy of it and what we're seeing today, because we're still seeing the impact of that. And that's why history is important. This is why the voice of Serena Williams, even if it starts with the voice of Serena Williams, I don't care who it is, but to get the word out there, to make this more widely known, for people to understand that as a person of color, just being a person of color, you could be in the best conditions with the most money and in the best hospital and being treated like a VIP. But unfortunately, because of your race and how we came to be in the colonies, because she's of West Indian descent as well, in the colonies and in America, that we're still at risk of dying because of all that weathering, which is a term that a colleague of mine from Michigan, that weathering that we've had for generations and generations, that I bear the heaviness of my great-great-great-grandmother today, and that my boys will still bear some of that burden, regardless of the fact that they're of mixed race or whatever thing they wanted to call it in the book. There was Creole, mulatto, and all these other names they gave for them. They're still going to bear that burden, right? And to understand that. But that doesn't mean it's an immediate death sentence. Just understanding that means that I can make a difference. I can be a better advocate for myself, for my family, for my community, for all my loved ones, right?
Just really quickly, thank you, but just to connect back to the history, I did a lot of work around racism and impact of racism on birth outcomes and health outcomes. And so when we talk about going back to the history is very important in this country, but I do think we go back to some of the libraries in America, some of the books need to be pulled off the shelves, and books like yours, Douglas Blackman, Michelle Alexander need to be put in there. The training has to include what new folks, what the voices are saying today, because it's true that West African proverb, the true story of the lion is never told if the hunter is always telling it. So lifting up women's voices and getting them in books and doing the work that we do is very important. So the history is important, but some of it has to be rewritten, because in medical schools in this country, remember, the history book said black bodies were not even human, so that's why they justified genetics. And just my sister friends, I just met them recently, and we had a call last fall for those doing work around black maternal mortality, and we had overwhelmingly, the table was white. And I asked the question boldly, where are the black women that are working on this issue in New Haven? And so I said we have a challenge here. And so we did write a grant, and Healthy Start received another 5 years of funding. We got a second grant to focus on black maternal mortality. You all were part of the plan. The Yale system is part of the plan to bring everyone together to do exactly what she said. So I just wanted to lift that up, because some good things are happening in New Haven. So we will have those dialogues to bring the community, doulas, midwives together to really focus on this issue. And lastly, I'll say, because the celebrity factor, that she mentioned Serena, but a celebrity that I love is Tina Turner, and I love her because of her story, and I do women's health because her story is like my two aunt stories. Tina Turner lives outside of this country because she said that America looks at her as a celebrity. They've never acknowledged her as a black woman. That's why they've never heard her story. And so again, I'm saying we need to lift up the voices. So again, regardless of what you got, at the end of the day, you're black. And I'm at risk as a black man here, not because of my blackness, but how I get treated as a black man when I dress down as well. So let's keep that clear too, because that's a new message. Because in infant mortality, we don't want the message to be to people of color that your children will die early just because you're black. No, the message is the racism, the impact of living in this country is what's going to kill you. Thank you.
Thank you all for this panel. I think our videotape for this should now be shown to at least all undergraduates, whether they're thinking of a medical career or a history career. This shows that you go together. And thank you all for coming and all of your comments.
Sign up for our newsletter list.
Yeah, you'll get bombarded every week with all the things.
And you can go on Amazon now. You can actually go on Amazon now.